You're standing in the grocery store checkout line. You're staring at two jars of peanut butter. One costs $3.50. The other costs $4.20. You're doing actual math in your head over 70 cents. You're shifting your weight. You're half annoyed at yourself for even caring this much. 3 feet away, someone grabs the same jar. They don't even glance at the price tag. They toss it in the cart and move on to the next aisle like the jar owes them nothing. They're not richer than you because they earn more. In a lot of cases, they're not richer than you at all yet. They're just further along in a decision they made a long time ago. The decision to stop thinking about 70 cents. And that one shift, small as it sounds, might be the actual dividing line between the people who quietly get rich and the people who stay stuck their whole lives wondering why.
Most people assume rich people got rich by being cheap, clipping coupons, skipping lattes, guarding every dollar like it owes them alimony. That's mostly a myth, and it's a comforting one because it lets you believe you're one Starbucks boycott away from financial freedom. You're not. I'm going to bust this myth twice, back to back, with two men who built massive fortunes in completely different industries, on different continents, and somehow ended up living almost identically. Stick around, because both stories are going to wreck how you think about spending. My name is Bob. I spend way too much time thinking about money, psychology, and why some people build wealth almost by accident, while others grind for decades and stay exactly where they started. If you want to understand how rich people actually think about spending, not the fairy tale version, hit subscribe. This is going to change how you look at every purchase you make.
Let's start with something researchers stumbled onto almost by accident while studying parole boards. They noticed judges were far more likely to grant parole early in the morning. That likelihood dropped sharply as the day wore on. It only reset after a lunch break. Same judges, same laws, same categories of cases. The only thing that changed was how many decisions their brains had already burned through that day. This is called decision fatigue, and it's not a metaphor. It's a measurable, repeatable effect. It doesn't just apply to judges deciding someone's freedom. It applies to you every single day. Every time you stand in a checkout line doing math on peanut butter. Every choice draws from the same limited mental battery. Name brand or generic, highway or back roads. Answer that email tonight or let it rot until morning. By the end of the day, that battery is running on fumes. And that's exactly when the big decisions show up. Uninvited, like they timed it on purpose. Should you take the job offer? Should you finally ask for a raise? Should you have that hard conversation about money with your partner? Guess what happens when you're making those calls on an empty battery? You avoid them completely.
Or you default to whatever feels safest, even when safest is quietly the worst option on the table. This is the hidden cost of obsessing over small purchases, and almost nobody talks about it because it doesn't sound like a real financial problem. It's not really about the 70 cents. It's about what that constant obsessing is stealing from you every single day without sending a receipt. Wealthy people didn't figure this out by reading psychology journals. Most of them stumbled into it completely by accident. Once you have enough money that 70 cents genuinely doesn't register, your brain stops flagging it as a decision at all. It goes automatic, invisible, gone. And that frees up an enormous amount of mental space. Space that quietly gets redirected toward the questions that actually move the needle. Is my money working as hard as I am? Is this the right moment to negotiate? Should I take this risk on a new opportunity? That's the real difference between wealthy thinking and scarcity thinking. It was never about the size of the bank account sitting there. It's entirely about where your attention gets spent. And attention, unlike money, doesn't come back once you burn it.
Here's where the actual numbers get interesting, and they might surprise you. If you buy a $3 coffee every single day for 40 straight years, you're looking at somewhere in the moderate 5-figure range of lost investment growth by retirement. Annoying if you sit with it too long, nowhere close to life-altering. Now take a single bad decision on where you choose to live, or a car you didn't actually need. A car payment that's just $200 more than necessary, sustained over a decade and invested instead of spent, can quietly cost you more than $100,000. $100,000 from one decision made in an afternoon at a dealership, probably while a salesman was refilling your coffee. Nobody agonizes over that car payment the way they agonize over the coffee, and that is exactly backwards. Wealthy people flip the entire equation. They stop sweating the small stuff. They start obsessing over the handful of categories where most of their income actually flows every month. For almost everyone, that comes down to three things: housing, transportation, debt. Everything else is noise wearing a price tag. Picture a glass jar you need to fill completely. Big rocks, smaller pebbles, and fine sand. Fill it with sand first, and the big rocks will never fit, no matter how hard you shove. Put the rocks in first instead, and the pebbles and sand naturally settle into every gap around them. Your financial life works exactly the same way. Most people spend their entire lives obsessing over the sand. The coffee, the snacks, the small daily temptations that feel like decisions, but aren't really. Meanwhile, their rent, their car payment, their interest rate sit wildly oversized and completely unexamined in the background, quietly draining far more than any latte ever could, while nobody's watching because it doesn't feel like spending. It just feels like life. Now, here are the two stories I promised you, and I want you to actually notice how similar they end up being, because that similarity is the entire point. Warren Buffett has lived in the exact same modest house in Omaha for decades, despite being one of the wealthiest people on the planet. He's famously known for stopping at the same fast food drive-thru most mornings. He orders off a routine that barely changes year to year. He's talked openly about picking his order based on how the stock market's doing that day, treating himself to something slightly nicer on good days, like the market owes him a biscuit. If that's all you ever saw of him, you'd assume frugality alone built his fortune. It didn't. That same man has approved acquisitions worth tens of billions of dollars in roughly the amount of time it takes most people to order lunch, whenever the math genuinely made sense to him. So before you picture him as some monk of thrift, remember this: he's cheap about biscuits and ruthless about billions. That's not a contradiction, that's the whole strategy. You do this too, by the way, just at a smaller scale, and probably in the wrong direction. You've got a version of the biscuit decision and a version of the billion-dollar decision happening in your life right now, this week, and there's a decent chance you've got them backwards. Hold that thought. Now take Ingvar Kamprad, the founder of IKEA, who built one of the largest furniture empires the world has ever seen. For most of his life, he was known for flying economy class well into old age, long after private jets stopped being a stretch for him financially. He drove an aging car past the point most people would have quietly traded it in out of embarrassment. He furnished his own home with the exact same flat pack products anyone off the street could buy for themselves. Meanwhile, he built his empire through enormous, aggressive, occasionally billion-dollar decisions about factories, global supply chains, and store locations spanning dozens of countries. Two men, two industries, two continents, decades apart, somehow living almost the same way because they both stumbled onto the same rule from opposite sides of the world. Ignore the sand, guard the rocks, deploy hard the moment it actually counts, and don't feel bad about being boring the rest of the time. Quick request before we keep going, because it genuinely helps. If any of this is clicking for you, tap that like button right now. It tells the algorithm real people are getting value from this. It helps this video reach more people who need to hear it, instead of another ad for a crypto app. Now, let's bring this down to a scale you and I actually live at, because billionaires are interesting, but they're not exactly relatable. And I'm guessing your problem isn't a spare factory you forgot to sell. Two guys started at the same warehouse job. Same year, same starting pay, same schedule. One of them treated every small purchase like a minor emergency. He skipped lunch out with the group constantly. He tracked every single receipt in a notebook like it was evidence for a trial. But he leased a newer truck he didn't really need because it felt like something a hard worker deserved. He rented an apartment closer to downtown because it felt like the right move for his image.
The other guy never thought twice about grabbing lunch with coworkers or splitting a pizza on a Friday. He just didn't think about it at all because it genuinely wasn't worth thinking about. But when it came to the truck, he asked himself one question.
How many years of his actual life was that upgrade going to quietly cost him? He kept driving a paid-off decade-old sedan instead, and honestly didn't care what it said about him in a parking lot. When it came to the apartment, he asked the same question about location and moved 15 minutes further out, where rent ran $300 cheaper every single month. He never made a spreadsheet. He never tracked a receipt. He just stopped negotiating with himself over lunch and started actually negotiating on the 2 or 3 decisions that were quietly worth more than everything else combined, stacked together for the rest of his life.
10 years later, same job title, same raises, same everything on paper. The second guy had a full house down payment saved and a steadily growing investment account. The first guy was still leasing a truck. He was still renting the same apartment, treading water, wondering privately where the money kept going since he was so careful about lunch. Nobody watching them split a pizza together would have guessed any of this. The difference was never visible in the small stuff. It was hiding entirely inside the 2 or 3 big decisions neither of them talked about very often. The ones that never came up over lunch. The ones that quietly ran in the background for a decade while everybody was busy watching who ordered what off the menu.
That's the exact pattern that trips almost everyone up, and it's worth understanding why, because it's not stupidity, it's just how attention works. Small purchases happen constantly, so they feel highly visible in the moment. You notice every single coffee because it repeats so often. Big decisions happen rarely, a car every several years, an apartment maybe once a year, if that, so they somehow feel less scrutinized in your head, despite being dramatically, sometimes staggeringly larger in actual dollar terms. Wealthy thinking corrects for that blind spot on purpose. It deliberately slows down and applies real scrutiny to the rare, high-dollar decisions most people rush through on autopilot, usually while a salesperson is smiling at them.
Here's a practical tool you can start using today, even before your bank account catches up to this mindset. It's called the hourly wage test. Take your annual income, convert it to a rough hourly rate in your head. Before making a small purchase, ask yourself how many minutes of actual work that item costs you. A $5 coffee might cost you 6 minutes of your time. Framed that way, it stops feeling significant at all, and you can move on without the mental spiral. Now flip that same test around on a big purchase instead. A car that quietly costs you 3 full years of your working life suddenly feels very different than a monthly payment that looked perfectly manageable on paper at the dealership under fluorescent lights with someone hovering nearby holding a clipboard.
There's a social layer to all of this too, one that almost nobody talks about openly. When you're constantly anxious over small purchases, it shows, even when people around you can't quite name what they're noticing. It reads as scarcity in a salary negotiation. It reads as scarcity in a job interview. It reads as scarcity in something as simple as a conversation about splitting a dinner bill with friends. Someone who doesn't visibly stress over minor costs tends to read as more composed, more confident, more in control of their own life. And that composure quietly opens doors that seemingly have nothing to do with money on the surface. Better opportunities, better offers, people simply taking you more seriously for reasons they probably couldn't explain if you asked them directly.
Let's deal with the obvious objection head on, because it deserves a real honest answer instead of a dodge. If you're currently living paycheck to paycheck, small purchases genuinely do matter enormously. Every single dollar is doing critical work just to keep you afloat, and no amount of hourly wage math changes that basic reality. This entire mindset shift isn't aimed at someone in true financial survival mode. It's aimed at the much larger group of people with stable, decent incomes who still white-knuckle every minor purchase purely out of old habit rather than actual necessity. And if you're wondering why so many finance experts still push the classic skip the coffee advice anyway, it's because that advice is simple to teach and easy to act on immediately. That makes it a genuinely good starting habit.
Not because it's where the real money actually lives. It's the on-ramp, not the destination. The warehouse worker with the down payment saved didn't graduate by tracking less. He graduated by finally pointing his attention at the two decisions that actually carried weight and letting everything else run on autopilot.
Here's a number worth sitting with for a second. When people receive a raise at work, research on spending behavior consistently shows a surprisingly large chunk of that extra income gets absorbed into lifestyle upgrades almost immediately, often before any deliberate decision is even consciously made. A slightly nicer coffee order, a few more takeout meals during a busy week. Harmless enough in isolation. But the real cost is what quietly happens next. Spending rises to match income, right on schedule, like it was contractually obligated to. The gap that could have gone toward your rocks disappears without anyone ever noticing it happen in real time. Wealthy people guard against this instinctively. They keep their day-to-day spending nearly flat, even as income rises, and redirect that difference straight toward investments or debt payoff instead, quietly, without throwing themselves a party for it.
You're back in that checkout line now, peanut butter jar in hand. Except this time you already know exactly how the 70 cents plays out. It was never really the problem. It was just the easiest thing in the world to obsess over because it felt controllable in a life that often doesn't. The real leverage was always sitting quietly in your rent, your car payment, your interest rate, patiently waiting for you to finally look at it the way Buffett looks at a business deal, the way Camprad looked at a supply chain, or the way that second warehouse worker looked at where he chose to park his truck. Put the jar in your cart. Don't think about it again. Stop guarding the sand. Start guarding the rocks. And watch how much lighter and how much genuinely wealthier your entire financial life starts to feel. If you want more of this, how money actually works, not the version nobody explains right, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.